Okay, so I will give the floor to Dr. Philipp Maas of the University of Leipzig, who has written some important books and research papers on Patanjali Yoga Shastra, on Sankhya, and many other themes on yoga. And I'm very happy that Dr. Philipp Maas is one of the organizers of this Congress.
Thank you very much, Sukadev. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm very grateful for you that Yoga Vidya is so kind to host this conference. As you already mentioned, we all were looking forward to meet in person in Bad Meinberg. That would have been a fantastic opportunity after this long pandemic, which prevented all kinds of personal interaction and brought great difficulties in many respects to communities worldwide. So when we started planning this conference, 18 months ago, or maybe even a little earlier, we had not even thought of the possibility that a pandemic like this might take place. Corinna and Vedamurti were so kind to ask me whether I would be interested to organize with them a conference on the topic of yoga in Maienberg. And I was very, very happy to accept this invitation and to actively participate in the planning of this conference. Why did I do so? Because of very positive experiences that I had made earlier in my career at the University of Vienna, where Karen Preisendans, Karl Bayer, and I, with the help of many other people, organized a yoga conference in the year of 2013 under the title Yoga and Transformation. This conference had a slightly different focus than the one that we are having now. At that time, we hosted scholars that are not only concerned with studying ancient texts, but quite a number of scholars who were taking anthropological approaches to the phenomenon of yoga as it happens today. This conference was fantastic, I have to say, in all modesty. It was a great success. We had several hundred people coming from all over Europe to join us at that conference, to participate, to discuss. And the most, how should I say, rewarding feature of this conference was the open attitude and open-mindedness in which the exchanges took place. The exchanges among those scholars who actually attended the conference, who came from, as I already mentioned, very diverse fields of study, and the interaction between the general audience. So we really had the impression that we had achieved something that we could contribute, that the research we were doing was taken seriously, and that we could enrich the state of knowledge in the yoga community. And the event was already extraordinarily nice and friendly, and an experience that I will never forget. Also coverage from the Austrian broadcasting station ORF, who made a 45 minutes documentary of the conference. We had radio interviews. It was really, really something that I think brought a boost to yoga studies, especially because we were able to, in the end, bring out a volume that I may show here, Yoga and Transformation, of the revised papers, edited by Karl Bayer, Karen Preisendans, and by myself. 630 pages of interesting material on the phenomenon of yoga. And we were actually successful in publishing this very nice volume in open access. That means that this volume is available as a PDF free of charge for everybody who is interested. And yeah, this very positive experience made it very easy for me to say, okay, let's have another conference 8 years later, in which we then take a new effort to communicate our newer research on the topic of yoga. Because quite a lot of had happened in these in the time after the conference Yoga and Transformation had happened. There were two huge research projects that took place with the help of the ERC, the European Research Foundation, the one in London at SOAS, the Hatha Yoga project, and the other one at the University of Vienna under the direction. The first one was directed by Jim Mallinson, whom we have among our speakers. We're very, very honored to have him among our speakers here. And the other one by the other project at the University of Vienna, which dealt with the relationship between yoga, alchemy, and Ayurveda. That was directed by Dagmar Vujastik. And among our speakers, we have here now two researchers who worked together with Dagmar, that is Jason Birch and Christelle Bauer. Yeah, as you can imagine, this sponsorship that yoga studies then received from the European Research Council, that has boosted yoga studies, modern yoga studies, again, quite a lot. And all these things were not, all this research had not taken place when we published this volume. So there is really a lot of research that can be communicated. And I think that can be communicated in such a way that yoga practitioners and the general public may also profit from this. I mean, this is also one of the aspects that we will discuss in the conference here. What is the relationship between academic studies and the practice of yoga? How can it be important to be informed about the historical background of the practice that I have chosen for myself, and which roles should philosophical or reflection also play during one's practice. Yes, and another aspect that actually speaks in favor of having such a conference, which brings together people with different backgrounds, is, of course, the situation of the humanities at universities worldwide. As you all know, the governmental support for the humanities was reduced over the last, maybe 20 or 30 years continuously, which has put the academic study of pre-modern South Asia under pressure. In Germany, the very existence of institutions at universities that teach Indology as a subject is actually under threat. And in many places, chairs for Indology have been closed over the last 20 years in Germany. So I think it's very important that also we as academics find new paths of collaboration. First of all, to improve the level of discussion and knowledge outside the academia, and especially for the yoga interested public, and then also for satisfying the demand for information in the yoga community, which I think is there, and there is a huge interest, and that this conference happens now, and that we have quite a number of people joining this conference actually indicates this. And this showing ourselves to the public then may in the long run also help to create some new awareness within the public that the academic study of pre-modern South Asia is a valuable field of research from which also the public can profit, and that may also then help to support the situation for Indology as an academic subject at universities. And this then again will help to increase further the level of knowledge that feeds back into the society and so on. And in this way, I hope that it will be possible to create something like a spiral of understanding and knowledge. And yeah, I sincerely hope that this conference that we are having here, which hopefully will also lead to the publication of a volume, of a book containing the papers of this conference, will then contribute to the process that I just have described. Yeah, so much from my side, and I would now like to give the floor to Corinna Loa.
Yes, namaste. I'm greeting all of you, and give me a moment to say thank you to so many wonderful, familiar and not so familiar yet faces all around the world for making my dream, a very huge dream of mine, come true. It's a wonderful honor to be here. Unfortunately, not in person, as we all had wished until a couple of days ago, where we were forced to switch to the online format. But still, it's a great chance and a great opportunity for so many people to unite and to present research, new research on yoga studies to an open-minded public all around the world. And I see so many people here from all different edges of this world. And yes, welcome to all of you guys. And I'm so glad to see you all here today. I'm Corinna Loa. I'm a PhD student at Hamburg University, and I'm a lecturer for the history of yoga there. And I was in charge or I'm still in charge of establishing a Center for Yoga Studies at Hamburg University, which has been a great honor so far for me. Why did we establish the Center of Yoga Studies? Well, let me give you a brief insight into my own history in connection to yoga and yoga studies. It's now 5.5 years ago. It was in January 2016 when I had just finished the first part of my own yoga teacher training, and I arrived at Hamburg University, a woman of 46 years of age, knocking at the door and saying to the professors, "Can you please teach me Sanskrit? Because I want to know more about yoga, more about the yoga texts, and just, get a little more insight into all those theoretical backgrounds that I had just experienced in my daily practice and in my practical yoga teacher training." And I was received with very open doors. The university opened the doors for me. They started teaching me Sanskrit, then they started to teaching me the history of India and Tibet. They started teaching me major works of the literature there. I was later happy enough to be accepted to SOAS, the University of London, and do a master's there in the traditions of yoga and meditation, which has broadened my mind tremendously, and which was a wonderful experience. And when I returned, I put all of my effort into this Center for Yoga Studies, which is supposed to fulfill the role of a bridge between the academic aspect of yoga studies today and the practitioners that might be interested or are interested in learning more about the theoretical background. What we do is we do offer several courses also for the interested public. We started out with a Sanskrit summer class, which is now a Sanskrit yoga summer class since 2017, where interested people can come and study Sanskrit with us from scratch for 2 weeks in a very intensive manner. And of course, with a focus on yoga and yoga-related texts, mantras, and whatever there is for, related. Right now, we are in the beginning of starting a certificate course in yoga studies, which we did in cooperation with the University of Hamburg Center for, Erwachsenenbildung. Well, actually, it's a course not on academic level, but you don't need to be a student at the university. You can come as you are, and you're welcome to participate in the certificate course. We have had several lectures so far on different subjects in connection to yoga, and I'm looking forward to designing more offerings, more courses, and more classes. Come to our website and inscribe yourself with your email address for our newsletter, and we will we'll be glad to share our programs with you. Just as Philip has described, I think it's very important for universities today to actively, to take an active role in society, to talk to the people on the streets, to open up and make themselves more visible, and also to explain what is going on in science. I think especially in our times today, it's very important to have this openness, and also to participate actively in a discussion in society, and invite people to share into this discussion, to learn from it, to share their thoughts and their ideas, and also ask their questions. And this is something that, what I want to extend to you today, when you are now participating in these 3 days of, lectures and presenting of ideas, of a year-long research, don't be silent. Take the opportunity to ask the questions in your mind that you have in your mind, or that might have popped up during those lectures you are going to hear. This is a great chance for all of us to get into contact, to exchange our ideas, and never forget that the subject that we all love, that we all devote so much time to, yoga, is always a living tradition. It has always been something that is alive, and it's us today, especially the practitioners, that are the future of yoga. And this is what I want to extend to you. I'm wishing all of you 3 wonderful days. I want to extend my thanks especially to the wonderful team of Yoga Vidya, Sukadev. Thank you for hosting us. To the great event team, Amari, I see Ganesha here, and all the others that have supported us so greatly during the last weeks, especially when it got really tough with time and everything. So you guys did an amazing job. I'm looking forward to all the cooperation that is hopefully to come in the future. And I'm wishing all of us 3 wonderful days. And we have another 8 minutes, I think.
Vedamurti is here now.
Is here. Okay, then let me just hand over to Vedamurti, and see you on stage.
Namaste. My name is Vedamurti, and excuse me, the router crashed, and so I'm online now with my mobile. And it's very nice to hear these kind words. And we started, I looked the email conversation. We started in January 2019. I sent an email to Corinna, but then she was in England, and then we got back, did a Skype session in December 2019, and then we met in Cologne last year in January, and fixed the date, this date, I think about April or May. And it was really great to be in contact to Philip and Corinna. And it's very good for me, because I have an academic background also, as I was assistant professor in business economics. And for me, it's a big pleasure and honor. After 16 years, mainly in the yoga area, teaching now to be back in contact with academia. And yeah, and for me, it's a good perspective to work together, because it's important to integrate these two fields of yoga practice and also to apply the mind, the buddhi. Buddhi is very important, because I like to study Vedanta texts and teach Vedanta texts. So I'm very happy that we come together now to join these two spheres of academia and yoga practitioners. And I'm looking forward to this conference and looking forward to further cooperation with you, Philip, Corinna, but also the other speakers. So our goal is to be or to bring a platform for the integration of these two spheres, and to promote the knowledge in Germany, but also in Europe and all the world. So thank you very much for coming together here. And I think I give back now to Corinna, because you introduce the first speaker.
Maybe as we have a few more minutes, I just want to make a short Befragung. How do you say it in English? So maybe all of you who are working at universities as scholars or studying Indology or teaching Indology or something related can either lift up your hand or put your virtual hand by pushing on Reaktionen or reactions. So I can see. Okay. So now you can see many of our illustrious speakers and others who come from that area. Okay, wonderful to see you. Now the next question would be, you could now remove your hand again, and then you can put your virtual hand, all those who are yoga teachers. Some might lift up their hand twice. Okay. And then maybe those who are neither yoga teachers nor yoga researchers or Indologists, you can raise your hands. Okay. So we have the few who are part of both worlds, and we have a few, probably yoga practitioners, I would assume, who are now interested on the academic research or knowledge that we have. Okay, so we get a little feeling for each other, and we could see a few more have already put their camera on. Now, if those who have not put their camera on could put their camera on for just for 60 seconds, then we can see a few more who is participating here. Okay, quite a few additional faces, I know. And of course, if due to bandwidth you cannot switch on the camera, that's of course fine. Or other reasons than bandwidth. Okay, what I also sometimes like to do at the beginning of workshops online, we can just look at each other, scroll through each other, connect with each other. Maybe not to each other, wave to each other. Nice to see you all, and thank you for joining and coming. Now I also want to welcome those who just arrived now. I see we have a few who are just arriving for the next talk. I think we have 30 more seconds to introduce it, but already will give the floor to Corinna Loire, who will introduce our first speaker for the first talk of this conference, New Light on Yoga.
Thank you, Sukadev. And once again, welcome. It is my great pleasure and also honor to introduce to you Dr. James Mallinson from SOAS University of London. Jim is, of course, internationally recognized as one of the world's leading experts in the history of medieval Hatha Yoga, and it's a wonderful pleasure to have him as our first speaker and have him open this conference. Thank you, Jim, for joining, and thank you for accepting our invitation. It's wonderful. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I know we have agreed on keeping it simple, so I will not talk about Jim's various achievements that he has gained throughout his long career while he has been a reader in Indology and Yoga Studies at SOAS University of London. He's the chair of the SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies, which has been such a great inspiration for me, which he set up in 2018. And I'm not talking about his doctoral thesis, which was a critical edition and annotated translation of the Yoga Vidya, which he has done in supervision by Alexis Sanderson at the University of Oxford. And I'm also not going to talk about the 5-year, 6-person research project on the history of Hatha Yoga, for which he had received a European Research Council Consolidator grant worth 1.85 million euros. These outputs of which we are very much anticipating, and we are very curious to learn more. Among his many publications, and actually the one book that has made a great difference in my own life and study was Roots of Yoga, which is an anthology of translations for more than 160 texts on yoga, which he co-authored together with Mark Singleton. It's published by Penguin Classics, and I can just recommend it to all of you because it's really a fantastic book if you want to really dig deep into the single elements of yoga studies. He's right now leading a new UK-German project along with Professor Jürgen Hanneder from Marburg University. And this is funded by the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the DFG Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. They are editing the Hatha Pradipika, which is also considered a very, very prestigious and important project for us. So I'm not going to talk on all of this, but I'm going to open the floor for Jim Mallinson, and I'm so glad to have you here. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Corinna. I'm very glad you didn't mention any of that stuff. So yeah, didn't need any of that. And thank you so much to you and to Philip for inviting me to speak, and also to all the organisation for the Yoga Vidya team, so David, Amurti, Ganesha, and everyone else I've been in touch with. Great disappointment not to be there in person. I'd also like to say, you know, scrolling through, as Dave suggested, scrolling through to see who's online, and so many friends and colleagues who I would, you know, I've missed over the last couple of years, and would very much like to be seeing them in person. That will have to wait. But anyway, at least we get to chat anyway. Okay, so what I'm going to do, let's see if I can get my slideshow working. Where are we here? Is that going to work? Okay, now I have decided on a bar across my screen. If that's okay. A rather huge topic, and I'm somewhat sort of in trepidation in that I'm proposing a thesis that could just be blown away with just one tiny bit of evidence. But it's something I've been thinking about, pondering for years, for decades probably. And the idea is, and it's as a result of this this research project that Corinna mentioned, the Hatha Yoga project, contemplating all the evidence we looked at over the course of that and previously to that, I now think that Hatha Yoga, that physical yoga practice, is a complete novelty and innovation on the Indian scene from about 1,000 years ago. And I used to absolutely not think that, and I brought up a couple of quotes of mine, if I can find them. Hang on, let me make this work. There we go. So the first one's from the Brilliant Encyclopedia of Hinduism, 2011. I have an entry in there on Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga is first referred to by name in Sanskrit texts dating to around the 11th century CE, but some of its techniques can be traced back at least 1,000 years earlier to the epics and the Pali canon. And then in a bit more detail in an article that was published 2016, but actually I think it was from a lecture that I gave in 2011, the techniques of Hatha Yoga are not taught in Sanskrit texts until the 11th century or thereabouts. It is my contention that they did not appear ex nihilo, but that they developed from techniques practiced by ascetics from at least the time of the Buddha. The Buddha himself is said to have tried both pressing his tongue to the back of his mouth in a manner similar to that of the Hatha Yogic Khechari Mudra. And then I go on to talk about some other things. But yes, so, my PhD thesis was about Khechari Mudra, this technique in which the tongue is turned back and put above the soft palate in the mouth in order to taste the nectar of immortality. So I thought that, I was previously, I think like most people, I thought all these yoga practices must be thousands and thousands and thousands of years old and that we must be able to trace them. And I thought that they had just been, my contention was that they were practiced for thousands of years, but they were only written down for the first time 1,000 years ago with the first Hatha Yoga text. But now with all the evidence that I've looked at, I don't see anything at all that proves that the distinctive practices of Hatha Yoga were around before the text's arrival. Presumably the text maybe a little bit later than the practices first appeared. But yes, I think this is an innovation about 1,000 years ago. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that in this talk now. So in fact, during fieldwork for the Hatha Yoga project, we met this ascetic Amar Bharati, who was an Urdhva sadhu, had held his arm up in the air for 40 years. And we were talking to him. I've met him many times, and he said this to me a few times, but and this was during the Kumbhaka in 2013, but he then repeated it in subsequent meetings. And we asked him about what he was doing, and we said we were researching yoga. And he said that what he did, he said, Ye prachin yoga, this is the ancient yoga. And I somewhat sort of, shrugged it off, thought he was being slightly, ironic or, saying I do the real yoga. But with hindsight, I think, he was probably onto something. And if we look at, here, I've got a quote here from the Mahabharata talking about a Brahmin, a certain Brahmin, Babhuva Brahmanaha Kaschid Mandavya iti Vishrutaha. So he was called Mandavyaha. And he was, here we can see he was Satye Tapasi Chastitaha. So he was fixed in true, real practice of tapas. Sa Ashma Padadwari Vriksha Mule Mahatapaha, that great ascetic at the root of a tree at the gateway to an ashrama. He stayed there, he lived there as a great yogi, a Mahayogi Urdhva okay, with his arms in the air. So here we see no kind of distinction or complication between someone being called a great yogi and a great ascetic with his arms in the air. And as others have looked into in more detail than I have, and I think Philip, Dr. Mars, has looked at this in some detail, that it's quite hard to disentangle yoga and tapas in the Mahabharata, in the epics. And we find many statements similar to this, along similar lines. This one says, it's an instruction to practice, to pursue yoga siddhi, success in yoga, and general success siddhi, tapasa, by means of tapas. Okay, so the two things are very closely related. And tapas, of course, means various different types of ascetic practice, including physical mortification. So yeah, what I want to get at here before I turn to Hatha Yoga itself is how our only evidence for physical practice in the context of religious practice before the arrival of the Hatha Yoga text is for tapas type mortification and penance. So here we see an image from the British Library of illustrated Ramayana, a manuscript of Vishwamitra who's said to have been performed tapas in order to become a Brahmarshi, and this is showing the various different physical practices he's said to have done, including hanging from a tree. Here we have this Urdhva Bahu holding his arms up, again holding his arms up but standing on one leg, and so forth. Okay. Similarly, I'm going to look at some texts as well, but similarly, in the reports of foreign travelers, most famously Alexander the Great. So here's, there's this well-known story of Alexander meeting the gymnosophist somewhere in northwest India, in Punjab probably. He meets these ascetics, and the physical practices that they do, there's talk about other stuff, but the physical practices that they do quite clearly, let's move along, tough physical postures. He encounters 15 men standing in different postures, sitting or lying down naked, who continued in these positions until the evening and then returned to the city, and so forth. And there's another one. He meets two more gymnosophists. One of them lies on the ground supine, enduring the sun and the rain. The other stood on one leg with a piece of wood 3 cubits in length raised in both hands. When one leg was fatigued, he changed to support the other and thus continued the whole day. Again, in the material record, we don't see, and this is something I'm going to return to because I'm going to show in the second part of this talk how it's only from probably the 13th century that in the material record we start seeing depictions of physical practices other than either seated postures for meditation or methods of tapas, of bodily mortification. And here, perhaps, I'm not convinced, but it seems possible that seeing as how everyone else seems to be an ascetic of some sort, we have two Urdhva Bahu ascetics here on this relief at the great stupa at Sanchi from the 1st century BCE. Now, of course, we get a lot of information about early physical ascetic practices from the Pali Canon and the stories of the Buddha. The Buddha famously is said to have rejected such practices, but he did try some of them. And in fact, we can even find this is a more typical passage. It's from the Nangbutta Jataka, where it talks about a grove of Arjivakas or naked ascetics practicing false austerities, and a number of the brethren, i.e. the Sangha who are with the Buddha, seeing them there painfully squatting on their heels, swinging in the air like bats, reclining on thorns, scorching themselves with 5 fires and so forth in their various false austerities, were moved to ask the Blessed One whether any good resulted therefrom. None whatsoever, answered the Master. And of course, that's the classic motif, the classic theme story is that the Buddha tries these things and then decides that they're no good. But actually, one doesn't have to look that hard. Obviously, he famously tries fasting and holding his breath and so forth. But also, there are a couple of mentions of him trying more physical methods. So here he announces in the Majjhima Nikaya, I was one who stood continuously rejecting seats. I was one who squatted continuously, devoted to maintaining the squatting position, and so forth. And then, in theory, he rejects this. Although, interestingly, I've looked into this in the context of wondering why, if he's said to have rejected such practices, we get all these rather amazing depictions from Gandhara of the fasting Buddha. If he decides that this is no good, why would he be valorized? Why would murtis be made of him looking like this? And in fact, in some transmissions of the life of the Buddha, of the Pali Canon, particularly in early Chinese translations, when he undertakes these austerities, he doesn't then reject them. In fact, they just seem to be steps along the path. But anyway, that's sort of slightly going away from my main point, but but just want to emphasize that there was a lot of this going on, and of all the depictions and descriptions of such practices, we don't see anything corresponding to the physical practices of Hatha yoga or to modern yoga. Okay, and so in the material record continues. I've just got a couple more slides. This famous one of Arjuna's Penance at Mahabalipuram, where we have a Urdu Bahu ascetic, but there are loads and loads of these. I could have dug out more. And here's one of Parvati from the 8th century. Again, she undertook strict austerities in order to win over Shiva. So she's depicted here standing on one leg and with both arms in the air. So that's the sort of material record and the more extreme tapas side of things. But then if we look at I'm now going to turn to the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, again, somewhat, venturing out of my usual Hatha Yoga realm and knowing that there are some great experts in these texts in the audience. But if we look at what constitutes physical practice in Patanjali, of course, there's asana and there's pranayama. And the asanas, it's 12, I think, that are given here. I won't go through them all, but when they are described, when they are explained elsewhere, they are clearly, so this is from the Bhashya, but when, for example, in the Vivarana, I think it is of Shankara, or attributed to Shankara, there are detailed descriptions of what these positions are. They're all seated postures for meditation. Okay, so again, my point is that prior to the Hatha Yoga corpus, we only see seated postures for meditation or difficult, painful, mortificatory postures, or just holding an uncomfortable position for long periods. Now, the purpose of asana is then explained as tato dvandvanabhighataha shitoshnadipir dvandvar asana jayan nabhibhuyate. So the sutra itself, then, as a result, tataha dvandvan abhighataha, there is no abhighata, there's no suffering, injury from dvandvas, pairs of opposites, extremes. And that's explained as saying, i.e., as a result of mastering asana jayat, one is not troubled, overcome, abhibhuyate, by extremes such as cold and heat. Shitoshnadipir. There's no mention of asana is good for you, or it's going to make you feel better. Or, well, I suppose it makes you feel better, but only in that you're not going to be suffering from these various things. And then also with breath control, pranayama. Here, pranayama is said to be, so tasmin sati, this refers back to asana. When good asana has been attained, pranayama is the stopping of the flow, the gati vicheda of inhalation and exhalation. And as a result of that, kshiyate prakasha varanam, the covering of light is lessened, i.e. the shield of one's own luminescence is removed. And then there is yogyata manasaha, so there is suitability of the mind for the dharanas, i.e. the next of the 8 angas. Again, there's no notion of any of these practices causing bodily benefits or anything like that. It's purely about their, the progression through the angas, ultimately aiming for samadhi and then kaivalya. We do find within the text some mentions of physical perfection. Okay, so in the 3rd pada, the Vibhuti pada, when it's talking about samyama, concentration on various different things, in 344, if you concentrate on stula, swarupa, sukshma, arthavatva samyama, so as a result of samyama on those things, gross forms, true natures, subtle forms, inherent qualities, and the arthavatva, the purposefulness of the elements, there arises conquest of the elements, bhuta jaya. And as a result of that, there is the appearance of the special powers such as anima, the ability to become infinitesimal, and there's Kaya Sampat, okay, perfection of the body. I won't go into the other things, but then Kaya Sampat, perfection of the body, is defined in 346 as Rupa Lavanya Balavajra Samhana Natvani. So beauty, Lavanya, grace, Bala, strength, Vajra Samhana Natva, that's like being as firm as a diamond. So these things can arise, but you don't get them through doing asana or pranayama. Similarly, I think I've got there's another one, 243. Kayendriya Siddhi, so perfection of the body and the senses, arises understood ashuddhi kshayat tapasaha. So as a result of the removal, the lessening of impurity, ashuddhi, through tapas. Okay. So, and then tapas is defined as various different things. I don't think we need to read the rest of that description though, but it's just, it's through tapas, it's not through. I mean, I suppose one could understand, because tapas is then defined here, and one of the various different forms of tapas is here. Tapo dvandva sahanam. So tapas is the ability to put up with dvandvas, so extremes of opposites, as was mentioned before, and those opposites are things such as jigatsa pipase, so hunger and thirst, shitoshne, as we had before, cold and heat, sthanasane. Now this other commentators explain as meaning sitting down, or standing up or sitting down for very long periods. Okay, so there is that, perhaps there's that connection, but I don't think there's no suggestion that it's through the physical practice of doing these things that will then produce the kaya sampat, the beauty of the body. Okay, in any of these various methods of mortification or austerity are said to produce them. Okay, so that's it for the sort of the forerunners, and I'll now turn to Hatha Yoga itself, and we can look at the contrast, okay, between what we've seen here and then what comes from about 1,000 years ago. So I've got a list here of the innovations, I think, that one finds in Hatha Yoga. So first of all, complex balancing asanas or postures. So prior to around about this period, there are no asanas which involve balancing or these kind of more contortionate positions. Complex breathing methods. These are normally known as kumbhakas, or variations of pranayama. Dynamic methods of manipulating the vital energies, i.e. mudra, and then finally cleansing techniques, the shatkarmas. And I'm going to look at the first three in turn in a bit. I'm not going to go into detail about all of them, but I just want, bearing in mind this idea of, whether they are beneficial towards the body. That's the aspect I want to look at. And the Hatha Pradipika, the text which, as Corinna mentioned, we've got a new project going to edit it with Nils Jakob Lewis, actually, who's speaking next. And that gives the sort of distinctive components of Hatha Yoga. That lists them and says their sequence of practice, their posture. So asanam kumbhakam chitram mudrakyam karanam tata. Atta nadanusandhanam abhyasanukramo hate. So in Hatha, in Hatha Yoga practice, the sequence of practice is asana posture, then breath retention, kumbhaka, then chitram mudrakyam karanam, the amazing technique called mudra, and then nadanusandhana, the concentration on the inner sound. So these are the distinctive practices of Hatha, and in fact I'd say that the last one isn't distinctive, in fact, nadanusandhana, because we do find forerunners of that in tantric texts, but the Hatha varieties of the first three are certainly innovations, or in my opinion. And now I've got another verse from the Hatha Pradipika showing the results of success in Hatha. So you see at the end there, Hatha Siddhi Lakshanam, so the signs of Siddhi at Hatha. And now they're So we've got those distinctive physical practices, and then their direct result is things such as vapuhu krishatvam, so thinness, having a thin body, leanness of the body, vadane prasannata, having a shiny, glowing complexion, nada spurtatvam, which I think that refers to the internal sounds, so manifestation of the inner sounds, nayane sunirmale, very pure, very clear eyes, arogata, lack of disease, bindu jaya, so mastery of bindu, so basically sort of sexual continence, agni deepanam, a kindling of the digestive fire, nadi and nadi vishuddhi, purification, clarification, cleanliness of the inner channels. Okay, so I think the point is that it's rather different from what we see in Patanjali. Here we've got this direct connection between physical practices with good physical results. And then if we look at the practices themselves, and moving on now, first of all, just as a quick look, because I haven't got that much time, have I? I'm going to try to wrap up in about 15 minutes. It should be okay, I think. When we look at the text, so with asana, the first non-seated yoga postures that we find in any text, or the first one that we do find, is this Mayurasana, the peacock pose. And that's first found in a text called the Vimanarchana Kalpa, probably from the 10th century, could even be a little bit later, could be 11th century. It's quite hard to date, but Kola has dated it to probably the 10th century. And then a little bit later, we have in the 12th century, in the Ahribudnya Sanghitar, that's a typo, I think, Kukutasana, the rooster or the cock pose. We have no precedents for these. And I think what's quite interesting actually, when if I go back to Mayurasana, it sort of just appears out of nowhere. It's rather odd in this text. There's nine asanas are listed. It's the 9th. They are said to be divided into 3 sort of grades or qualities. And the lowest is the last 3. So Mayurasana is among the last 3. So it's one of the lowest, but that's all that's said. So just, why, where does this come from? How has it suddenly appeared? And we can sort of trace by looking at how it's written here, then gets turned into verse in subsequent texts. We can be pretty confident that this is the first text, certainly in that transmission, to include it. But it makes no, it's just introduced with no fanfare whatsoever. But then by the time you get to the Hatha Pradipika, when that writes about the Mayurasana, it announces all these various sort of physical benefits. So the Asanam Shri Mayuram, the glorious peacock pose, overcomes doshas, so imbalances, that must mean, in the 3 doshas. It gets rid of all diseases quickly, such as those of Gulmodara, it's one of these internal ones that have a splenitis. It completely turns to ashes any bad food that you've eaten excessively, and it stimulates the digestive fire and burns up, consumes any poison that might have been ingested, i.e. like a peacock would do. So we get these very clear-cut physical benefits of doing this posture. More generally, texts such as the Vivekamartanda, even though it says there are 84 lakh, so 8,400,000 postures, but it only teaches 2 Vivekamartanda. But it says by posture, asanena rujo hanti. So by means of asana, one gets rid of diseases. And the Hatha Pradipika says pretty clearly, kuryat tadasanam staryam arogyam changalagavam. So posture bestows steadiness, starya, arogya, freedom from disease, and angalagava, so suppleness, flexibility, I suppose, lightness of limb, angalagava. So again, very clear physical benefits. So that's a quick look at asana. If we move on to Kumbhaka. Now, Kumbhaka sort of somewhat curiously becomes this term because it originally means, kumbha means a pot, and it's this idea of filling the abdomen with air, and it's usually used to refer to breath retention, so holding the breath, but it comes to be used more sort of generally to various different methods of breath control, including inhalation and exhalation in the Hatha Yoga text. But prior to these texts, really the only teachings on breath control that we get are for relatively simple alternate nostril, not always, in fact, not even always alternate nostril breathing. That comes in, I think our first reference to that is in the Nishvasa Tattva Sanghitar, so an early tantric text. But it's basically just controlled inhalation and then and exhalation, and also holding the breath for long periods is basically what constitutes pranayama prior to the Hatha Yoga corpus, as far as I'm aware. And it's associated with, it's associated with tapas in a way. It's seen as a way of purifying oneself, and even of getting rid of sin. And in fact, yes, I think my next quote says that quite clearly. This is in the Vivekamartanda as well. So we don't need, even here, it's still seen as a sort of purificatory thing. So that the verse that the quarter verse that I quoted earlier continues with pranayamena patakam. So one gets rid of sin, pataka, by means of pranayama. So it's understood to have this purificatory mechanism. And that then gets expanded to the purification of the body. And we find this actually earlier as well, before the Hatha Yoga corpus in tantric texts, but this is the idea of nadi shuddhi. It's seen as a preparatory technique necessary for some of the higher practices in Hatha Yoga. And you see here, yeah, it's so sort of the basic, it's often called anuloma viloma, isn't it? Alternate nostril breathing. And the Vivekamartanda teaches that if you do that, after 2 months, one's channels are all, 3 months, one's channels are all purified. But then the Hatha Yoga texts introduce, first of all, this list is from the Hatha Pradipika. The first 4 are first taught in a text called the Goraksha Shataka, and the Hatha Pradipika, of course, borrows a lot of its verses from earlier texts, to which the Swatmarama, the composer of the Hatha Pradipika, adds the following 4. But I'm just going to look now, because it's only directly relevant really, at the first 3. So if we look at the Surya Kumbhaka, the first 3 are said directly to rectify imbalances in the doshas. Okay, so if we look at, I won't see, time is ticking by. I won't read this all out, but the Surya method, where is it? So destroys the 4 diseases of the wind humor. Okay, so problems of vata. Okay, and then similarly, the Ujjayi Kumbhaka just completely removes phlegm from the throat. So it's said to act on kapha, and then Shitali acts on pitta, that can combat imbalances of the pitta dosha. So again, these techniques are really seen as directly having a beneficial physical effect. And now, before I move on to mudra, there is one sort of more ancient result of breath control, which I think is of relevance, is key to understanding what's going on in a lot of yogic texts, ancient and Hatha Yoga as well, is this idea of udghata. So this is a quote from Roots of Yoga, which Corinna was so kind about in my book with Mark Singleton. And udghata, I won't read all this out either, but it's this idea where we see it here, Somdev Vasudevas, to summarize. Udghata appears to be the yogic term for the sensation of a spontaneous upward surge of vital energy brought on in the early stages of self-induced asphyxiation. Yes, it's not, again, it's moving slightly away from the theme of whether things are good or bad for the body, but I think it's important for understanding. This idea of raising vital energy up the central channel, which becomes so important in the Hatha Yoga text. That notion is not new, but I think the methods for bringing it about are new. Okay, and as we say here in the Swachanda Tantra, so this upward bursting, as the air jumps upwards, it can pierce the granthis along the central channel, and in the Swachanda Tantra, that's said to enable the yogi to become Shiva. And a couple of tantric quotes as well, Nishvasa Tattva Sanghitar. early mentioned, it's Udgata, when the breath, having been restrained, goes to the head, and then it's thought to come back again. And in the Mrigendra Tantra, there's this passage here, says that it prescribes the posture for the yogi, keeping apart his upper and lower rows of teeth, using his heels to protect his testicles from painful pressure that may occur if he jerks upwards as a result of the ascent of the vital breath. Okay, so this idea of, it's really quite a dynamic thing that happens. And I think that that in various subsequent yoga texts, for example, in the Amrita Siddhi, which I'm going to talk about, it's something akin, something similar to this notion of Udgata is going on as the main aim of the practices taught in the text. But now, rather than simply just holding your breath for a long period, there are extra physical methods prescribed to help bring that about. So if we look at mudra, in fact, in the early Hatha Yoga texts is the defining practice of Hatha Yoga. So in the very first text, this Amarauga, we get these 3 techniques, which I'm going to look at in some detail shortly. And then there's a text called Viveka Maratanda. I put it in square brackets because it doesn't actually use the word Hatha, but I think this is a chronological progression, introduces these other mudras. And then the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which I think is drawing on both these 2 texts, and does say, and again, in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, Hatha Yoga is identified just with these practices, okay? These which later become to be termed generically as mudras. And these are all, I haven't got time to go into the detail about all of them. I'm going to look at a couple in a minute, but they all involve in some way or another projecting some form of vital energy up the central channel, okay? And then finally, the Shiva Sanghitar and the Hatha Pradipika incorporate all the ones that have gone before, add the Shakti Chalani, which is taught in the Goraksha Shataka, and then this becomes a fairly sort of canonical set of 10 mudras, and these are kind of the higher practices, the higher physical practices of Hatha Yoga. Now I'm going to look at the Amrita Siddhi, which is the first text to teach any of these practices. This is the oldest manuscript we've got of it, which was perhaps, from which we can infer that the text was around by the late 11th century. So it's at least as old as that. Now the Amrita Siddhi, if I go back here, the Amarauga is this Shiva text, but the Amarauga draws directly upon the Amrita Siddhi, which preceded it. Can't be sure, probably by a century or 2. And so those 3 practices from the Amarauga are first taught in the Amrita Siddhi. And the Amrita Siddhi introduces various other principles and practices, various principles of yoga that have then become central to most subsequent Hatha Yoga texts. So these include the idea that within the yogic body, there's the sun at the base of the central channel, the moon at the top of it. The fire is also with the sun. Yoga practice is taught to join the sun and the moon, to raise the sun up to the moon. There's also this idea of bindu, semen, really. It's kind of identified as the male generative essence within the body, and that is to be controlled. These 3 gruntis, 3 knots along the central channel. It's the first text to teach them. And then it teaches these 3 practices, which are later known collectively as mudras, the Mahamudra, Mahabandha, Mahaveda. It also teaches, for the first time, we get lots of previous texts which teach a connection between the breath and the mind. That goes back to the Chandogya Upanishad. But the Amrita Siddhi then adds the bindu to this. So there's this sort of added physicality to this, to the connection between the mind and the breath. And the idea is that by controlling any one of these 3, you control the other 2. And of course, breath is the easiest to control. So the practices within the text work on the breath. And then there are these 4 states or stages in yoga practice and 4 levels of aspirant, which again are become common to subsequent Hatha Yoga texts. Gosh, I'm not aware of the time. I think I've bitten off more than I can chew. Let's see how I go here. Right, so this is the first practice, the Mahamudra, of the three in the Amrita Siddhi. And the idea is that the heel is at the perineum, left heel is at the perineum, right foot is extended. The yogi holds the right foot and fills the abdomen with air. And then in Mahabandha, the yogi locks the air within the body at the base of the by a sort of perineal lock, by compressing the perineal region and then performing the throat lock. And then within the text, it's taught that the yogi is to lift himself up and then drop himself down. And curiously, this practice does not seem to have lasted in India, and we don't find any sort of very accurate understandings of it in subsequent texts, nor do we find any depictions of it. But it does, for various reasons, the teaching of the Amrita Siddhi have survived in Tibet. And so we do see, I've just got a quick bit of footage here of a Tibetan yogi doing what may be related to this practice. So again, you see it's a very dynamic physical method, and doing this is meant to, you've compressed the breath into the abdomen. By doing this, it's meant to make it shoot up the central channel. So it's very similar to what I mentioned earlier as Udghata, this idea of the vital energies shooting up the central channel. Okay, how have I got? Gosh, I should try and wrap up in 5 minutes. I'll have to be quick. Yeah. Okay, so just have a quick look at inversions as well. I think they're interesting. Any form of upside down postures, because they seem to they do appear in various different places. I've got at least 4 instances of them appearing in new forms around the 12th century, 12th or 13th century. So they seem to, again, I don't think it's coincidence that we hear nothing about this type of inversion until that period. There is this idea of this tapas position of hanging upside down from a tree. It's called the Baguli Vata in Pali, the bat penance, the swinging in the air like bats, as you see here. The Buddha refers to it from that quote I looked at earlier, and of course this is represented on the in this illustration from a Yoga Vidya manuscript, which we used on the cover of Roots of Yoga, Tapkar Asana as the ascetics posture. But that seems to be distinct. Sorry, I've also got an illustration here of Shambhu. This is like a penance. It is seen as a penance. So Shambhuka, the Shudra ascetic in the Ramayana, he hangs upside down from a tree as a penance. And that did actually go on until about 100 years ago. But we seem to see a whole new notion, a whole different idea of inverted ascetic practice appear, as I said, in about the 12th or 13th century. The first one I'm going to look at, I'm going to whiz through it, is the Yogi Dharamnat, who lived here in this region here of Kutch in far west Gujarat. And he is said to, by the virtue of standing on his head for 12 years, he acquired such ascetic power that the sea used to come in here all the time, and he dried it up and created these grasslands in Kutch through the power of his asceticism, which was accumulated by him standing on his head for 12 years. And so he created this desert area. His monastery is up here. There, you can just make it out on top of the mountain. And here's the site of it, where I think it's here, perhaps he's said to have done his headstand. And he's still worshipped. So this is a contemporary illustration. You see he's meant to have done his headstand on a betel nut and then turned 180 degrees at the request of the gods, because otherwise he would have destroyed the land. So he burnt up the sea instead. So we still have this, this legend of inversion. I'm not 100% sure, but I do think he dates to probably around the 12th century. Very hard to be certain about this. So there's still this notion of tapas there, okay, with this inverted headstand. And in fact, there's still a living tradition there of yogis still performing similar penances in the hot season. This yogi Maheshnath would stand on his head for an hour and a quarter every day of the hot season. But around about the same period, we find in the Yoga Shastra of Hemachandra, who was writing here in the late 12th century in Patan, he's the first Sanskrit, or the first author to write about headstands in the context of yoga in his Yoga Shastra. So in the commentary, the Svapagya Vritti, he talks about a couple of postures, the Duryodhanasana, which is a regular sort of headstand, and then also adds that it can be done in the lotus position. And then one of the sort of most exciting discoveries we made during the Hatha Yoga project was this gate at Dubois, which was, I think I was able to pin it down, I'm reasonably confident, to almost exactly 1230 for its construction. And it's covered in wonderful carvings, but up here in this part of it, we spotted a whole load of yoga postures, complex yoga postures, which makes, these are the oldest by at least 250 years, probably the oldest known depictions of complex yoga postures, postures other than seated positions for meditation. Okay, so there's more appearance of headstands, and then there's various others as well. And then at the same time, more or less, a text called the Viveka Martanda was composed, and it teaches the Viparita Karani, which is one of the mudras I showed in the list earlier. It literally means the inverter, or turning something, reversing something. So the idea is, I won't read all this out, where you can see that the moon faces downwards. So the moon at the top of the head faces downwards and rains nectar, and the sun at the base of the central channel, in the genital region, or just above there, faces upwards and takes that nectar. And then the technique, the Viparita Karani, is a technique of stopping that from happening, okay, which is then meant to stop you from aging and ultimately from dying. Now, what's interesting, what we discovered, because we're editing this text as well, I say we're still going, haven't quite finalized it yet, not far off, but for the Hatha Yoga project, the Viveka Martanda. And then there's a passage here which I actually thought was about Khechari Mudra, but since we've looked more closely at the text, it becomes apparent that actually the yogi is still upside down. Okay, so, and it must be in a shoulder stand type position, because the face is upwards. And this is made clear in this last section here. When he cuts, so the idea is that the nectar of immortality has been sort of stored in the throat, in the Vishuddhi chakra, and then drips into the nose, and then ultimately goes into the head. So it's returns to the head, so it's stopped from being consumed by the sun. But it then says when the yogi comes down onto the ground with his face still upwards. So I think this must mean that he's in an inverted position, but not a headstand. I think he's in a shoulder stand. And then as he does that, he then floods his body with this nectar, is the idea. But it's cheated the sun. Okay, so my point there is that, having had no yogic headstands or inversions taught anywhere, suddenly in around the 12th, 13th century, 11th, 12th, 13th century, there's been over at least 4 instances of them appearing. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up here. And I think I can, even though I've got another 20 slides or something, they're just pictures. So as I mentioned earlier, we have this Dubois, the gate at Dubois, where we first see complex asanas being depicted. But then over the subsequent centuries, in various places, and I could have included more here, there's been some great research done by some scholars in Maharashtra, looking at temples there, which also depict some early asanas, but I'm just going to show a few here. Sri Shailam, we have a couple. This is dated at the latest 1510. And then Vijayanagar or Hampi, there's plenty here. So we get sort of classic ascetic posture like this, but then we get these more bizarre sort of balancing difficult yogic methods, such as these. And these are interesting, I think, in that there's another one here, I like this picture too, where these are good reminders that we textual scholars need to look beyond our text, because none of these, or quite a lot of these postures, are not taught in texts. Okay, and interestingly, Daniela Bevilacqua who's working for the Hatha Yoga project, she met a female yogi in Benares who practiced something rather similar, which again, as far as I'm aware, is not taught in any texts. Okay. That one is under various different names. And then Sringeri also, we get a, so this is again early 16th century. There's some sort of classic poses, but then we get things like these two here and that one, which is quite similar to the one we were looking at from Hampi, and an inverted lotus. And then finally we've got Kukutasana. Okay. So that's it more or less. I've just got one quote at the end, and I did say I would sort of talk about this in my abstract. This is a passage from Amrita Siddhi edition, which I've just signed the contract today for printing. So that's everything done. It is now going to print. Hopefully, I don't know, all these things take so long, but this is so reflecting on this notion that, or trying to think about where these practices appear from. So many of the Amrita Siddhi's teachings are thus without precedent in Indian sources. Some of these apparent innovations are found in Chinese texts from the 4th century CE onwards, including aspects of yogic physiology, such as the existence of 3 barriers along the central channel, those 3 granthis that I mentioned in the Amrita Siddhi, the importance of controlling and uniting the otherwise mobile sun and moon. So we find that, it's a forerunner of what is very clearly put in the Amrita Siddhi, that the sun and the moon are moving around, but you've got to stop them and then unite them. And then that, as well as the broader framing of the practice as a reworking of sexual ritual into a technique for celibate individuals. Okay, so that, I think it's too many parallels for it to be coincidental. But then at the same time, I don't know of any precedents for the actual techniques. Okay, so the Mahamudra, the Mahabandha, the Mahaveda. And I think we can clearly say that those are first taught in the Amrita Siddhi, which is a Buddhist text. But then lots of the other distinctive techniques of Hatha Yoga, such as Khechari Mudra, and the complex asanas and so forth, they too seem to appear from nowhere, and when they do first appear, they're in Shaiva and Vaishnava texts. So that's the Hatha Yoga project for me answered many questions. Almost all the questions I had, but this is the sort of last big question for which I have no answer. Is from where do these practices suddenly appear? And I will anticipate, if we have a little bit of time for discussion. Sorry, I've gone on a bit long. But I often get asked, when I make claims like this, but what about the oral tradition? Okay, could these things not have, been passed on through a living tradition and never written down in text? And of course, that's not impossible. But I like, in this context, I like to think of the parallel of well, first of all, I think that, the weight of evidence is so strong. There's so much after 1,000 years ago, and there is nothing before 1,000 years ago. But also, if one looks at the comparable situation of the methods of tapas that we were looking at, okay, earlier on. So, for example, Amar Bharati with his arm in the air. There are no texts whatsoever teaching you how to do these things. Okay, they really definitely are passed down orally. Okay, that's within these ascetic traditions. Yet we know all about them from a very long time ago, because they are all over the place in our textual and material sources. Okay, even though they're just part of the oral tradition, but people write about them, people see them, people say that people are doing them, people depict them in temple stature and so forth. But these hatha techniques, we don't get anyone saying anything about them anywhere at all, nor do we see them depicted anywhere else. So my contention is that they are innovations in the yogic scene from about 1,000 years ago. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for this wonderful and enlightening talk on the roots of Hatha Yoga and the practices that suddenly appeared about 1,000 years ago. concerning the questions, I forgot to tell you that you're of course invited to put your questions into the chat already while a lecture or presentation takes place. We have Ganesha, who is going to watch over this and then collecting the questions for the presenters. Above this, we will also have panel discussions where we will devote time for any questions that may have appeared in the previous lectures, and there will also be talks in the evenings where you will have the chance to ask your questions. So if there are any further questions in your mind, please go ahead and put them into the chat. And I'm just going to ask Ganesha about the first outcomes so far. Ganesha?
Well, there was an interesting exchange at the chat. Most of the questions were answered by themselves on each other. Well, one question from Eva is, what was it? What is the meaning of sin? Isn't it a purification of the mind?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't feel qualified to hold forth on exactly what sin is, but yeah, I mean, it's obviously a weighted word. But partika definitely means, yeah, something. A partika, I suppose, is something that makes you go down, makes you fall down. You know, it's something bad that you've done. But you get similar. I mean, it may just be. Yeah, I think you get a similar formulation using the word papa as well, which means, you know, a bad deed. So the consequences of bad deeds that you've done in the past. I think that's fairly clear. But obviously, yeah, we have to be careful with the crossover with Christian terminology. But no, it's not. So what was it suggested that it meant something else? Purification of the mind. No, it's not that.
So well, you're able to open your mics by yourself if you have any further questions, what is not written in the chat right now.
So I see there's one more question of Eva, and then Philip has raised his hand. So I would read out the question of Eva, and then afterwards Philip. Okay. Eva says, which yoga texts describe kriyas and sexual practice like haṭhayoga pradipika?
Kriyas and sexual practice. I mean, none of them, well, actually very few, but there's one or two describe sexual practice. I've got an article with in the book that that Philip held up. I had this very sort of provocative title of Yoga and Sex, and that's all about this Vajroli Mudra technique, and that lists just about every text I could find that covers this, every Hatha yoga text that talks about sexual practice, which there's not much though, to be honest. Kriyas, well, most of, I mean, kriyas, if you mean that sort of more broadly for sort of cleansing techniques and so forth, there are lots and lots and lots. I mean, you could start, I mean, Roots of Yoga can point you in that direction, I think, to more texts of that nature.
Yes, I think Roots of Yoga is a good source for this. Philip, I think you can unmute yourself, right?
Yes.
Next.
Thank you, Jim, for this absolutely fascinating presentation. And I think the point that you are making, that these techniques of Hatha Yoga appeared only just 1,000 years ago, is very, very convincing. My question would be, do we have any idea why this introduction of physical yoga happened at this time? Are there any cultural or religious developments that would have helped introducing them or would have caused this development?
Thanks, Philip. Well, I'm relieved that you're convinced by the thesis, and the only thing I can get at that I'm sort of clutching at here is I think there is some, you know, exchange going on with China. As I said, I'm completely in the dark about where the practices themselves might have come from. But for example, I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that that Hatha Yoga and the techniques of sort of inner alchemy and external alchemy start to flourish at similar periods. And I think it's clearer in the case of alchemy that there was a lot of cultural exchange with China. Other than that, there's something. Actually, there's a name I noticed when I was flicking through the list of people attending, which I think that was Daniel Dimitrov or something. I'm sorry if I got the name wrong, and I may be someone completely different. But I did come across a short paper a while ago arguing for a sort of axial age, a second axial age around about 1,000 years ago, with somatic techniques appearing in all kinds of mystic traditions across the world. I can't really comment upon that, but it seemed perhaps there's something in it, because I think you can see similar things going on amongst Christian mystics and Sufis and so forth. But why that should be, I don't know. I'm wary of stepping beyond evidence at my fingertips.
Thank you.
Okay, we have just 1 minute left before we have the break. So I would ask Rafael Musa to be unmuted and ask his question, and Shaman and Alexandra and Sumangala to write their questions into the chat so it can be saved for a later state and a later opportunity. Rafael, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I hope my question has enough relation to the content of your talk. I'm wondering, the central channel, Sushumna Nadi, is nowadays quite often related to the spine, let's say to lie inside the spine, while I think that in earlier texts often it's said to go straight from perineum to crown. Do you know, or do you agree with this? And do you know when this change happened? This is my first question.
I'd have to start burying around in text to answer that question. I'm afraid I don't have the answer at my fingertips. I don't think it's sometimes said, that it goes through the spine. No, so I can't give you a clear answer there. I'd have to dig around a bit.
So the notion that it lies inside the spine is actually found in pre-modern texts? Yes,
because there's talk of the Vina Danda, which I think means the spinal column, or Meru, and it's said to be inside. Certainly in the Amrita Siddhi, it's meant to be inside Meru. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And maybe one more short question if we have time. I was also wondering about the chakras, when they became related to emotional qualities. Is there any evidence for this in pre-modern text?
Yes, there's one text that I know of, and again, I haven't looked into this in a lot of detail, but we include a passage from it in Roots of Yoga called the Sangeeta Ratnakara, which is really a treatise on a sort of musicology treatise, but then the chakras get in there, and they're connected with musical raga. I can't remember what aspect of music, but certainly with emotions as well. So you'll find that passage in Roots of Yoga. I don't know of any others though. It seems to me to be anomalous. And then I think, then there's a massive gap, and then we get, Carl Jung and so forth, an association between chakras and emotions much later on.
Mm-hmm.
So but it'd be an interesting topic to look into more closely, actually.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Okay, and thank you very much, Jim, again for your wonderful talk and presentation, and also for the great discussions already taking place in the chat. Please continue to do so. Feed the chat with your questions and information and exchange.